with some wonderful objects, and some of them are newly here. In other words, museums change for us, things to look at as well as old friends, and new ways to think, not only about a single object, but the ways in which looking at different kinds of objects together change what we have to think about. But in this case, what we have, and what I've acknowledged with John's wonderful direction in adding to the museum's collection at a time that is difficult to add objects, so they need to be very carefully thought about and vetted. But we are getting Sri Lanka in a way that has not been accessible for us in the West. This would have been something I think Coomaraswamy would have very much welcomed, to see these kinds of objects now upstairs, along with Southeast Asia and South Asia, as well as China and Japan and the rest of the world. So it's our great luck. I want to use for you today a simple thought to keep in mind, because what I'm going to try and present is the idea that what process was happening with Coomaraswamy in his writing and looking at geology, as well as the arts and crafts he studied for a while, influenced the ways in which he looked and studied South Asia, and then even in his very last years, turning almost completely to metaphysical issues or epistemology issues. He nonetheless had objects somewhere secreted in the back of his head. And so what I wish to offer you to start with today is to think about the way in which Coomaraswamy's work can help us move beyond the dichotomies that are now being inscribed into whether we are looking at religious objects or utilitarian objects, whether we are looking at fine art or applied arts. In fact, that last is one of the big battles he fought early on. Many people remember that he was involved in questions about Gandharan art, informing the development of the origin of the Buddha image. He fought against that, but he was truly fighting a larger fight. He was fighting for a place of fine art designations for South India, or South Asia. There was a great deal of pushback from certain unenlightened camps that could not see the qualities of artistic achievement in works that were essentially religious and not mimetic. So these are the things to consider, it seems to me, when we start to make any study of art, and particularly when we start to make a study of art that has been, to some degree, influenced by Ananda Coomaraswamy. Now, the problems are manifold when we try to think about his time. And one of them is Sri Lanka itself, which was at that point a crown colony, which is different than what was happening in India. Nonetheless, the resources of this beautiful island were largely in the hands of the British Empire. And it is this which got Coomaraswamy back to the island for a while. He was surrounded by people who were looking at the past, but like those in India, primarily the past was constructed in terms of ancient work. And even still today, Sri Lanka, because of its richness, is very often presented in terms of the very earliest material, such as what we see here, these reliefs from a stupa in Anuradhapura. This was not what he was interested in. In fact, it's rather difficult to say exactly what he was interested in. It's sometimes even difficult to find out personally who he was. I think it's becoming clearer now, but there's a great deal of misinformation out there. But here is a view of him on the left, taken by a noted photographer in 1916 when he was here in New York City, and a view a couple of years later when he has moved to Boston to become the first curator of Indian art in the United States, joining the museum after a large part of his collection that he had amassed has been bought by its trustee, Denman Ross. Prior to this, Coomaraswamy had accompanied, that is prior to going to Boston, he had come to America several times with his second wife, Alice, on tours here where she performed as Ratan Devi. Alice Richardson was apparently very accomplished at performing Hindi songs, and we see in this article on the left, written by Coomaraswamy, one of his other incredibly passionate fields, Indian music. And one might say, it seems from the evidence, that music was really an early, music and rhythm and dance were early interests, almost emerging at the same time or guiding that of art. As this article in Vanity Fair points out, Ratan Devi, is very popular. And in its early days at the MFA, he traveled back and forth between New York and Boston, primarily to see some of his family, but also many friends, including a newly romantic encounter. But he moved in a very distinct circle in New York City. And because I'm here in New York, I want to introduce this. It's not been completely obscured, but there's very little that's really been written about his relationships with one of the owners, well, actually both, but one of the owners of an amazing avant-garde bookshop run by two women who had anarchist beliefs, who were really interested in making a bookshop where people, a new bookshop, a modern bookshop. Mary Mowbray Clark and Madge Jensen were careful in what they selected and what they allowed into the shop. But they also published books, and remarkably, Ananda Coomaraswamy's most, I suppose, well-known volume, Dance of Shiva, which is actually a collection of essays, for which only one is about the Dance of Shiva, was published by them in 1918, a year after he has moved permanently to the United States. Not as well known as you would think, the Sunway's Turn Press also published other works, including, as you can see here, an amazing work about art, the drawings of Ananda Coomaraswamy. This gives you some sense of an individual who is very much part of a world that's looking around in terms of modernist interest. Now, there are now remarkably new things coming out about this period, but I think it is useful to celebrate, since we are in New York, down on 31st Street. Ananda Coomaraswamy first began to interact with larger groups. And like this lecture here, this is the way in which we get ideas that begin to set us off in thinking in different ways. Whoops. There goes my slide list. Oh well. But here it is again. Thank you, Harsha. I'm very lucky, and I wasn't going to do it, but I have to say that in all my career, I've had the most fun with a range of students at the University of Texas, some of them who are still here with me, although they are far gone from the university and now work in New York. So Harsha is moving through there. The fine art studies of Ananda Coomaraswamy's work is being kept apace with other interests, that is, interest in his music, interest in his publishing, as well as interest in his early life. But the thing that has intrigued me, as somebody who's dealt with Buddhist art, in particular Eastern Buddhist art, is the way in which he's not gotten a lot of recognition outside the origin of the Buddha image argument for his writing on Buddhism. And so it was always something I thought about. And eventually, by being able to go and travel in Sri Lanka, I realized that there was something here to try and figure out. So getting a measure of this man, his thinking, will remain complex, and there is amazing work being done by a number of individuals that I have benefited from, and that is one of the things that we can all celebrate about education at this moment when education seems not to be as well understood as it might be. We can also understand that archives and networks are some of the other ways in which we can approach new thinking. And one of these newly sort of developing awarenesses of Coomaraswamy is the fact that he both collected art and sold art. And here are two works that he sold much after the time he was the curator in Boston. He was allowed to do this. It's not something curators get to do now, but at that time he was allowed to do this. And these two fine works are now upstairs or in storage in the Met's Museum's collection, really fine collection and growing collection of Indian painting. These two, for me, really stand out in terms of the kind of unusual scholar he is, especially the drawing on the right that started out as a cartoon for a wall painting and then was refinished, reworked a bit for greater finish by the artist. This tells us something when we look at what he collected, not just when, but what kinds of things he collected. And of course, the vagaries of the market are always operating as to what is available. But there is choice here. And looking at his choices carefully is interesting. That was the path that first broke for me some ways to think about it, as I puzzled over his changing attitudes about Buddhist sculpture. It seemed more and more interesting that he had, in fact, himself spent time in Sri Lanka. He was actually born in Sri Lanka. His father was Sri Lankan, but his father died when he was 2 and away from the island, visiting England, which was his mother's home. And so they ended up staying there, and he ended up being raised and educated in England. He got 2 first-class degrees in London, but neither of them had that much to do with art. They were geology and botany. He was fully active in writing about geology and especially mineralogy for several years before he was appointed for a 4-year term, ultimately, which was to be the director of the Mineralogical Survey of Ceylon, as it was called then. This is Sri Lanka. I was amazed to find how little art historians or humanists have actually interacted with this material. This is really fascinating. But does it have a connection? And that was what I tried to parse out or tease out with respect to thinking about this period as the sort of foundation of the way that he was thinking as he moved away from science. While he was in Sri Lanka for those 4 years as the director, he also undertook a collaborative study with his first wife, Ethel Coomaraswamy. He and Ethel went in a rather amazing amount of effort to photograph, examine, and collect Sri Lankan arts and craft. Everyone is aware of this book, Medieval Sinhalese Art, written in 1908, that is a sort of fruition, the fullest presentation of that study. But there is relatively little thought about that material in relation to the other work that he then went on to collect and write about. And this was, I am not the last person to write about this, but this was where I found it most productive to consider his development. And it was kickstarted for me when I realized that actually he collected Buddhist bronzes, much closer to my heart in some ways, or at least my knowledge, while he was doing this collecting of arts and crafts material. Now, the arts and crafts material is incredibly late in comparison. We're talking 18th or 19th, if not even 20th century. The arts and crafts material is usually not thought about from a religious point of view. But I came to understand that Coomaraswamy was actually looking very often at material that was largely in the hands of the Buddhist monasteries that dominated the island at that time. These works, which are not Buddhas or necessarily Buddhist subject matter in painted forms, were nonetheless used or gifted to Buddhist monasteries. And he actually acknowledges that without the presence of Buddhism, he would have had a lot less to study. So at first, I did not see medieval Sinhalese art as especially a Buddhist book. But in fact, it documents what was available for looking at within this category of arts and crafts. So when I found or realized that he had in fact also collected 3 bronzes, but had not written about them for some years, then I began to think, well, what did these bronzes mean? Well, obviously, he encountered them as he was collecting other things. They're made of bronze, which in fact is one of the materials he's very fond of. But more so, these bronzes serve to actually help him craft an argument that let Gandhara be sort of brought down a bit as the originary form of Indian art. And even more importantly, these 3 bronzes are the, if we can say it, the sort of foundation of his construction of a canon. We see this in an article he writes in 1909, and then immediately after, the next year, an article called Indian Bronzes, but it's almost entirely, well, the majority of it, say 16 of the 18 images shown are Sri Lankan. And they are mostly, except for 2 examples, Buddhist. So Buddhism was important, not only what he saw, but what he collected. And he did not integrate them into an argument about arts and crafts, but they were very much part of the way he was thinking. So my book, and this will really be the last I mention that, tries to lay out that argument and its significance as he begins to grapple with the relationship of art and religion, which is a fundamental, important thing that all of us who teach or study or look at South Asian art think we need to deal with. But it was actually kind of new then, and it was something that was dealt with primarily in terms of subject matter, rather than thinking about aesthetic qualities. My progress with this book was slow. COVID helped a little that way. But it also took me into areas I frankly did not think I would ever go. Being a humanist, I didn't think I was going to ever learn about science, but I have. And I also learned more about museums, not museum practice per se, but the important role that we all have to put some history into understanding the development of museums. In the early 20th century, the Met was not anything like it is today, but it was nonetheless one of the forefront institutions in America that was trying to present a kind of comprehensive view for its audience, for the purposes of educating and bringing up the sensibility of its audience. The place that was firmly the leader in terms of Asian art was a little farther north, up in Boston. And it is still a very fine institution of looking at Asian material, along with other material. And so when we think about the ways in which museums choose or don't choose to collect this or that, and the ways in which money is given, we begin to realize that factor of education is often a really important motivator. And why not? Because the education we get at looking at works of art is unparalleled in some ways, as I hope to finish with this talk. a little more. In 1918, a year after Coomaraswamy took up his role at MFA, he wrote, well, he was always writing a lot, but he wrote two rather significant articles for the museum's bulletin in Boston. This was once something that was much more important as practice, as sort of giving the audience of the museum members and others, some sense of what was happening, what was changing. The two long articles that he wrote in 1918 reflect the strength of his collection then. One was about Indian painting, and the other was about Indian bronzes. And the Indian bronzes that he largely illustrated are what you see on the screen on the left. This is the first image of that article. They are works from Sri Lanka. So getting our heads around that sense of nationalism is not important, that for him, Sri Lanka was part of a South Asia idiom, and he could use freely these works to argue about the importance of South Asian artistic forms, in particular through bronzes, not through stones. It's completely opposite to, I think, what you would find a lot of people who might talk about the canon of South Asian art sort of broadly today. But this was the situation which Coomaraswamy had when he was building up his own collection of religious images. And so we can trace an awful lot of things about his thinking by just looking at that, and then looking at the fact that at the same time, the book that is so famous, Dance of Shiva, has a number of essays in it, but one that is really prominent is one, as you can see here on the right, about Indian art. And in that essay is a fair number of Buddhist works, and again, Buddhist works from Sri Lanka. In fact, in the image on the right, you see in this article his really very repeated presentation of his argument about dating, where he drew a connection between his small bronze, which is about like this, very important but small, and the very large rock-cut relief at the site of Ellora, the Kailasanath temple in India. It is usually dated to the 8th century, and it was that which allowed him to sort of ram home his belief that his image, his Avalokiteshvara from Sri Lanka, was equally early and equally fine. And it was this argument that he would continue to make about that work until he no longer made arguments about art. Although born in Sri Lanka and going to England for schooling, when he went back to Sri Lanka and served as the director for 4 years, he declined reappointment. And this is another aspect, I think, that we have to put next to his growing awareness of looking at art, the growing awareness of the significance of social and historical factors in the roles that politics play. This does not sound right here. Maybe I should think of something else to say. About the importance of the supports of art for everyone. He was reacting to a particular situation in the early 20th century where galleries were emerging in the West as places where artists could become artists and make money. And he railed against that with this kind of argument about the spiritual aspect of Indian art, meaning Sri Lankan as well as South Asia or India, in terms of fulfilling a role for common people. Not fine art for people who had money, but for everyone, a piece of what is socially important. He was so successful with his arguments about the importance of fine art in South Asia that people have not recognized or noticed, or it's been lost, that he made the arguments, the earliest ones, with Sri Lankan examples. The arts and crafts, however, are things that people are aware of him writing about. And they're aware of that work because principally the 1908 book, Medieval Sinhalese Art. They are usually called the arts and crafts of the Candian era, because Candian art was privileged in the 19th century in the great expositions like that in London and then in Paris. These works were the ones that they tried to bring into the sort of big expositions, as opposed to works that were looked down upon, that somehow had been made hybrid or less authentic because they had come into contact with the West, i.e., they had been made in the coastal regions where contact was more likely. And this is an important part about thinking of Coomaraswamy and his other sort of compatriots in art history at this time. Authenticity mattered, and it was often that which really was the leveler of whether something was interesting or not. Quality was something that came later. But authenticity is something that was used earlier by missionaries to some degree, denigrate any religion that wasn't that of the missionaries. And thus, religion is very much part of what drives the political choices being made far outside religious institutions. One startling record that I began to come across was the evidence of Coomaraswamy's early own artistic career in taking photographs and making drawings, but these were for science. These are, and most people have not recognized his photography. They see it as something that he develops in the 20s. But in fact, he and his first wife were accomplished photographers, she more than him, actually. But here are two views of his work used for geology, because geology, unlike some of the other sciences, is not a laboratory science. It is one very much based on field work, collecting specimens, and making either photographs or documents of what is being seen. And those of you who are historians in the audience may see a ring of some of the things you do. So I have encountered his work in this way. And I've encountered also the incredible importance of drawing specimens or literally mineral formations, which were so unknown at the time in terms of where the minerals had been created. They were usually only found in alluvial deposits washed out of the mountains in which they were created. So this aspect of visual literacy, we now call it, or close looking, or slow looking, is a practice that is shared in the construction of knowledge. And it's really clear that he was a consummate performer in this regard, and makes some sense then of his turn to look at arts and crafts when he and Ethel went to the island for 4 years. But she was not only collecting arts and crafts while he went on his day job, she was very often accompanying him on his survey mission across the island and producing photographs like these that you see. The one on the left is actually Coomaraswamy himself. So we have to rethink the idea of collaboration. We have to rethink the idea of science, and we have to very much separate our notions that the arts are separate from science for those who still want to somehow make the divides. Perhaps the most amazing document that I came across in reading his mineralogical reports, which are dry for someone who is not enamored of mineralogical reports, is the recognition in one of the reports of something very strange in his last year. This is the last report. It's signaled by a single sentence that he was seconded. He was liberated from his normal work to go work for 2 months on a rubber exhibition. Rubber has nothing to do with mineralogy. And so I wondered what that all meant. I found no further description in the reports or anything else associated with him. Where I found it was in the handbook of the rubber exposition, which was held in the fall of 1906. It was the first in the world to celebrate rubber and rubber technology, which if you think about cars coming up in the early 20th century, you can begin to see that this was an important commodity. A lot of money and attention had been put into trying to do this exposition. But what was the arts and crafts being part of the rubber exposition? He was so successful in apparently making in the island an awareness of these traditional crafts still processing, that the British authorities determined that it would be nice to have this as part of the deal for the 2 weeks. And so they set up a tent just for the art exhibition. He wrote a pamphlet that was separate about what was being shown. It included a small exhibition of old objects. Some of them were borrowed from other collectors. The majority were his. But the highlight of this event, he wrote in his small pamphlet, was the fact that the artisans had been brought together for visitors to see. Now, this is not a zoo. They were there working and making objects, and sometimes they could sell their objects if they wished. In other words, he set up a situation in which, he set up a situation in which he made it possible for normal people, if that's such a word, to actually encounter artists at work or artisans. So you see them here in the tent. Was a ring of them around the edge with the exhibition of old stuff in the middle. And then some of them were on the outside. There were some who were making iron, and in this case, it's an ivory worker. So this was what he emphasized in his writing. And yes, he was able to do this because he'd been studying it and he knew a lot of them. And he had in hand, he wrote, a very large work, which he was going to publish soon, about the arts and crafts. But even further, in terms of his ability to get people looking at material, is the fact that he also had convinced officials, at least a little bit, so that the governor of the island proclaimed that he was amazed that the traditional practices of architects worked so well with these Candian villagers. No plan had to be drawn up. Nobody had to come in from the outside. The villagers and their elephants, who are wonderfully presented here in this group picture, came together in 27 days to make the buildings for this enterprise. And the governor was so amused to say that he really couldn't understand why this wasn't done more often. Well, the problem was it wasn't done more often because support for traditional practices was very much being taken away from the people who were doing those practices, and those contracts were being given to other people who mostly worked in Western forms. And so the opportunities are changing here because of one particular reason. The British have taken over the island in terms of control, and what the king in the past would have supported is no longer being supported, except now if people will come and individually buy objects or support traditional buildings being made. So Coomaraswamy didn't win the battle in pushing back the onslaught of Western goods, but he did win something by getting people to look carefully at Western art. While he didn't stay on the island more than 4 years, he went back to live in England, living with a community of arts and crafts workers who were associated actually with his wife's family. So they lived near to them, and he became involved with them to the point that he was able to use the press that had gone into resting mode because the money for making the books of this guild had hit a financial dead end. But the owner, C.R. Ashby, allowed him to, who was a good friend, allowed him to take the press to his house nearby, and it is on that press that Ananda Coomaraswamy made his first book, self-published, a gorgeous thing, really. And it led him into thinking for a while that he may well self-publish other books. So medieval Sinhalese art is an amazing work for a whole variety of reasons. And there are many people who study arts and crafts really finely that are coming up with amazing things to say about it. But for me, what I found so interesting is the range of material and the range of discussion of that material. Buddhism was not a source, again, for these discussions, but so many of the works were ending up in Buddhist temples or were part of the embellishment of the temples that it isn't exactly separate. And it begins to get at, how do we define what is Buddhist art? And how do we define what is religious art or arts and crafts? So these are wonderful questions that we actually can begin to think about with what was happening with Coomaraswamy. He very much didn't see these as Buddhist. He did many good things, but some things he didn't get. But he offered the opportunity to think about this work seriously as art, to think also not just about the products, but the fact that these works are created by people who have learned very seriously their craft and who are inspired artists. They are works that are not religious in subject matter, but the material, the art of creating the work is very clear. And so we find in the book many drawings that show us very close, careful observation, either made by Coomaraswamy or his wife himself, or by earlier or other artists. The book is also full, and there are, I think, 53 plates, of many objects that they have gathered, so that you've got not only a sense of how things are made, think of the arts and craft exhibit at the rubber exposition, but you have examples. That is, specimens is part of understanding. Looking at specimens is part of that understanding. And the specimens of medieval Sinhalese art, unfortunately, are what is most often emphasized, as opposed to the way in which, although this is changing, I should say, because of all these good new scholars coming up, the notion of practice, of looking at material. And part of this is certainly the outflow of people being interested in larger issues of contemporary art, which for Coomaraswamy, other than the arts and crafts, was not something that he engaged, which, when we think about his own self, puts us in a little bit of an uncomfortable relationship at best. Some of the work in the early book, in this first book, is so beautifully rendered with color and careful printing. So very much this book is also a demonstration of an interest in fine books, as Morris had pushed in his own life as an arts and crafts venture. Now, with the coming of the new relationship with his second wife, Alice, breaking apart his marriage to Ethel, his notion of continuing as a fine arts press owner fell apart. But it is one way we can see his developing a sense of himself, a sense of the importance of art, and putting out in front of people good works to look at in terms of the books that he might produce, but also the examples that they hold. For one of the biggest pieces that we can take away from looking at his early career is the emphatic way in which he talked over and over again about the importance of being able to discern good work, which again is one of the core missions of having objects available for many people to see. We also, and I'll pass this by, but there's also a lot of evidence actually of the care that he put into creating the work and the need to think about the way it was organized. So medieval Sinhalese art isn't just sort of randomly put together. It took over a year and a half, even longer than exhibition catalogs today, some will note. But it also had to try to address an audience that might become subscribers. And so there's this brilliant document that survives of a sort of leaflet that's going to, you know, maybe you'd like to sign up and get one of these. But overwhelmingly, medieval Sinhalese art gives us ways to sort of look at what Coomaraswamy was thinking about the importance of art in discerning quality and the importance of architecture as that which was the driver of the other arts are two of the, I think, important takeaways from my study. And here is one of the images from the book to show you a traditional Kandyan-style building. He never showed us anything or even really talked about anything inside that temple. So once again, there are some shortnesses or omissions in thinking about his work. And this is true when he actually, in a few cases, shows us religious images. This is his own drawing, by the way. He made a copy of a wall painting. He is not interested in actually the subject. He's interested in showing us how the artist has represented elements of the time. He's not interested in ritual. He is not interested in the fact that much of Buddhist art is used to gain merit and to enable the donor to really gain something in terms of Buddhist practice. Instead, he was interested in recording what the artists were doing. And he was interested in making those artists discernible in terms of their qualities. Not all art is the same. And finally, what he did in this book is talk about the construction of how to look, how to think about what you are seeing. In this one particular example, and there could be many others that we look at, he is trying to discern the way in which the artist has laid out in the patterning a sense of the structure of the ceiling. That is, the decorative pattern here is about how this artist has created a sense of floral motifs that are mirroring, that are somehow reflecting the actual construction, the architecture. He wrote, "Study the temple ceiling," and you see his diagram on the right. "The floral ornament of the painted boards is overflowing with life and energy, but to turn to the great beams on either end where they are set, and which are the constructional elements of the roof and ceiling, we find that they are treated very differently." And for those of you who like to think about things other than South Asia, form follows function is one of the things that he is registering in a very South Asia understanding of this material. He then goes on to contrast how the elements are bringing forth an appreciation of the effect of different designs, and that the description of the ceiling's motifs is not just a description, but a lesson in studying structure. Here is where a link could be made, I believe, to his mineralogical work, which is, in part, studying structures and chemistry and how pressures create minerals. unraveling the effect becomes an approach that leads to a fuller exploration and eventually a fuller understanding of the meaning of forms. And the next steps move on to the ideas that we could call religious ones. So focusing on decorative details is a line of thinking that I believe propels him away or further beyond craft. But it came from craft, and it came from his close looking and work in the island and studying the mineralogy. So looking at his details are really, I think, important in terms of understanding what he ends up doing with constructing a canon. And to actually, I'm not arguing here to put geological specimens into the museum, but to understand and gain other knowledge about the other kinds of activities that are folded into his thinking is a way we can move beyond just listing what he added when to the museum collections he had control of or moved into other collections. And I think it's in this way that further work, and there is much to be done, can be made for the way in which we talk about the achievements of South Asian art. He goes on, finally, to look at art in India and makes the most amazing, and this is my last point, connection. And it's one that should be debated about what he's doing. But he is nonetheless looking carefully at older source material to realize that from a book about Buddhist art 2,000 years ago, he saw motifs that were actually quite similar to motifs he was studying in Sri Lanka. And I direct your attention to the armlet worn by the male figure on the pillar here from Barhut Stupa, which is the one exactly that he fingers when he uses it as an example. So again, the close looking and the care of thinking about the construction of elements is at the core of the way in which he constructs, I would say, the sense of a canon. And the dancer on the right, you see the other similar ornament. What he didn't do was manifold and large, and had much to do with just the way the world was at that time with respect to religion. So while he studied the Kandyan temples, their forms, many of the objects inside them, he never talked about the rituals or the people who were performing the rituals. So he is, unfortunately for me, one of the elements that has hampered our understanding of looking across cultures for a very long time. Now, this is being changed by wonderful studies that are shared on visual objects by not just art historians, but by those who are in religious studies or ethnography, archaeology, and history. But here, to end, the most interesting thing to think about is that in this large book, Medieval Sinhalese Arts, what is missing, quite literally, if you want to say it, the star of the show, it is not the objects on the walls, but it's the shrines. He rarely talked with any kind of seriousness or specificity about those large Buddha images that often appeared inside the shrines and were the reason of generating the merit that brought in the donations and the contributions, as well as the energies of the people who visited there. So this is what we have when we have some things surviving, like we have these wonderful objects upstairs to look at that show us ways to think about not just decorative arts that are everyday, but the qualities of the artists whose names we cannot identify anymore. But we also have to, I think, acknowledge what he didn't do, or the silences that have become also part of the South Asia canon that needs to be continually made and remade. So the fun of things is, I think, not to point out weaknesses, but to point out new opportunities for the next generations. And I thank you.
Thank you so much. Let me say a few words and stay with me.
As long as I don't have to say anymore.
John, you should join us on stage. So I'm Mike Hearn. I'm the chair of Asian Art here at the Met. And my job is always just to say thank you. And listening to Professor Liosko's wonderful presentation, a former curator who's also an academic, so uniting the worlds of museum building collections and teaching about those collections and works of art in the academic milieu, emphasizing tonight the importance of looking and looking closely. And you started your lecture with two beautiful slides of two ivories that John Guy is responsible for bringing into the collection. I note that Sri Lankan ivory is not endangered, and so it is still possible to collect. And John deserves my thanks for building an extraordinary collection of Sri Lankan art here at the Met. My third thank you goes to my mother, who was a geologist and mineralogist. And so I think there may be some connection between my choosing the world of art history and my mother's, after all. My fourth thank you goes to Jeff Soref and Paul Lombardi, who have for 17 years funded this wonderful opportunity to hear from specialists about the arts of South and Southeast Asia. And finally, my last thank you is to all of you for your interest in Asian art and in the Metropolitan Museum. Thank you so much and good night. That was marvelous. So nice
I'm a real for museums.
I can tell.
Yeah. Well, this
Thank
is
you. You're a great
yeah.
advocate.